So good to just see that steadfast love of God, to see His grace, to see His beauty, to see how amazing He is. And there are times in our lives when we hear God clearly, and it's almost like a downpour of His grace and His love. But there are other times where I think God is silent, and we have to wait on Him. We have to rely on Him. And that kind of becomes the time where we're tested. We are in the second week of a series that we've entitled Let It Be. And we've been looking at the life of Abraham and how God called Abraham and He set him apart for His glory. And how each of us called by God and called for God. And He has set each of us apart for His glory. And in His strength and in His might, He longs to do amazing things in and through our lives. We looked last week about the call of Abraham and how God reached out to him and He set him apart. And He began to say, follow me. And when God calls, we believe, right? When God calls, we believe. And then when God begins to lead us, we follow. And that's faith. And we learned that faith takes commitment. It takes a time where we aren't going to give up. We're going to be all in. We're going to continue to go that extra mile. And we learned about God's love and His commitment towards us and how He will show us. He will lead us. He will make us. He will use us. And He'll do amazing things in our lives if we allow Him to. And I want to take it a little further today and just build on that idea of commitment. Build on the idea of following God. Because faith is about stepping out, right? Commitment is proved over time, right? You don't say I'm committed and then don't put any time into it, don't put any effort into it. But commitment is proved over time. And we either walk in the will of God, we either walk with God, or we walk out on God. We walk away from God. And whenever God is loud and His voice is booming and we hear Him and we see Him, it's easy to follow God. But what do we do in the times where we can't hear His voice? What do we do in the times when God is quiet? What do we do in the times where we don't necessarily see Him moving and we don't necessarily hear Him speaking? I was speaking to a man this week and we were just talking about just praying, and he said, I've been praying, I've been talking to God, and I just don't hear Him. What do I do? What do we do in the times when we can't hear God? How do we move? We're going to talk about Abraham this morning. If you've got your Bibles, you're going to be in Genesis chapter 12. We're going to talk about how hard it is at times not to hear God and not to see Him. And that is a time of testing. That is a time where we are kind of tempted, right, to go our own way. We're tempted to do our own thing and to live our own life. But God calls us and He tells us that we are to trust in Him. We're to rely on Him. This last Christmas holiday, my family and I went to Atlanta, and we got to visit our family, and we were there hanging out with my brother-in-law and his wife, and just spending an amazing time with them and their two nephews. And the youngest nephew, his name is Braden, and he is 1, and he just turned 1, and he is learning to stand, right? He's got the stand thing down. He doesn't have the walk thing down yet, but he's got the stand thing down, and it's the craziest thing. Because what Braden will do is he'll crawl around to different things, and he'll crawl right up to it, and he'll get up there, and he'll stand, and he'll look around. You know, he's all excited, and he'll be excited, and he'll play, and he'll play, and he'll play, and he'll play, and then suddenly he gets a little cranky, and suddenly he cries out, right? He's like, ah! And then he cries out a little louder, ah! And then he cries out a little louder, and he gets a little upset, and eventually I was watching him and everything else, and I said, you know, what's going on here? And they're like, he hasn't learned to sit down. He gets up and he gets excited and he can stand and everything, but he hasn't learned to just sit down. He gets tired of waiting, and so he gets up, he gets upset, and so they'll go over and they'll take him and they'll sit him down, and he'll be happy. And then he'll crawl around and he'll go and he'll stand up. And so they were thinking, you know, what do we do with him? How do we kind of engage this? How do we get this? You know, they tried to make him sit down. They tried to teach him to sit down. And there's a little bit of stubbornness there, right? I think it's from my wife's side of the family, obviously. But there's a little bit of stubbornness there. And so they decided that they're going to get him these little walkers. And so they got him this little push walker, right, where he kind of gets on it. And I loved it because he got on it the first day we were there, and they had just bought it for him. They opened it. It was a Christmas gift, and they had opened it up, and he began to walk, and he's got his little jammies on, and they're flipping and flopping and everything else, and he's like stumbling along, and he's looking around, he's all, he's so excited about walking. He's so excited about going. And he's moving kind of slow, and he's not, real comfortable with it, but he's kind of getting the groove of it and everything else. And by the end of the week, I was in the office, and I was just in the office just spending some time in the Word, and just in the morning just kind of there, just hanging out. And I heard this little sound coming down the hallway. And Jackson had hooked him up with not his little walker thing, but those little cars that you sit on and you push with your feet, So Jackson had hooked him up with a faster walk, right? And so he comes and I hear him, and all of a sudden I hear him hit the hardwood floor, and he comes zooming by me, and he's like this, and he's like, as fast as he can go, and I'm just waiting for the dude to bust. But he is going. And it made me think, when we're with God and we're listening to His will and we're holding on to Him, that's kind of how we are, right? It's this faith. We're doing everything we can to keep up. We're doing everything to hang on to Him and everything else. And we like those times, and we're excited about those times, and this is new beginning. I love it because he'd run into a wall, and he would stop, and he would let us know that it was time for us to come and turn him. And he would just take off. But he still hadn't gotten the stand there and wait thing, right? And I was sitting in the living room watching football one morning, and Braden was on the couch with BJ, and they were hanging out, and I was just kind of watching BJ. He was on his phone, and he was watching Braden. He was being a good dad. He was watching him and everything else. And I was watching Braden from across the way, and he'd crawl back and forth on the couch. He'd crawl back and forth. He'd crawl back and forth. And then at this one moment, he begins to get a little brave, and he crawls over to the edge, right? And he peeks over the edge. And I'm just watching, and Braden lunges, right? And I jump up, I come flying up off that couch. BJ doesn't move. I come flying off that couch, and I run over there, and Braden goes back. And BJ looks at me, he's like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "I was going to save your son's life." He was about to go over the edge. And BJ looked at me, and he goes, "He'd only do it once." Tough love, right? Tough love. Tough love. But whenever it comes to us and God, I think He's the same way. I think at times He withholds His word because He wants to see how we react. How we react. It's easy for us to hear God's voice and run after Him, right? It's easiest for us to know what God is saying and do it. And there's so many times where I can remember where I was praying, and I'm like, "God, speak to me, God, speak to me, God, speak to me," and He did, and I was like, "Okay, I know where to go." But what about the times that we don't hear God's voice? What about the times where we feel like we're almost left on our own to really step out in faith and say, do we trust God? Do we rely on Him? It's easy to follow something you can see, but we're called to have faith, right? Faith is believing in something that we can't see. What about the times that maybe we can't see God? How do we respond? See, God knows what kind of faith that we have. And the only way to advance in that faith is to take steps. And at times, He has to kind of withhold His word and His truth and where He's at so that we step out in faith on our own, trusting Him no matter what. But oftentimes, that's the time I mess up, right? That's the time that I make mistakes. That's the time that I fail. But see, a faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. I love how Warren Wiersbe says that. A faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. If our faith can't be tested, it's not real, right? We can say we have faith, but until we actually step out in faith and we test that faith and we live in that faith, maybe it's not a real faith. Maybe it's just something that we claim. A faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. And so at times, God kind of withholds himself and he withholds his word and he waits to see how we respond and if we truly have faith in him. We're going to look at the story of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 this morning. In the first verse, it says this. Actually, I'm sorry. We're going to be in verse 10, not verse 1. In verse 10, it says this. It says, now there was a famine in the land. Now there was a famine in the land, and whenever I think of famines in the Bible, I think of God withholding kind of his blessing, God withholding his word, God withholding who he is. And so this test kind of comes in on Abraham, and there's this moment where I think Abraham and Sarah kind of felt like we all do whenever it comes to faith. We're going to step into God's will, and we're going to follow him, and everything's going to go perfect. Everything's going to be fine. But see, in this world, we're going to have trouble. And there's going to be hardship. And it's not going to be easy. And there's going to be times where God withholds the blessing. And there's going to be times where there's that famine and that hardship because this world isn't perfect and it isn't all it needs to be. And this famine enters the land and this true testing of his faith takes place. See, they probably thought they had arrived. They probably thought that their journey was over. But really, the journey of faith is just beginning. And for many of us, it's always just beginning. And a faith that can't be tested, can't be trusted. When things go well, we get comfortable, right? Very comfortable. Actually, when things go well, we get so comfortable at times that we take our eyes off of God. We take our eyes off of his blessings. We take our eyes off of who he is. And we look more to our circumstances. We look more to ourselves. We maybe look more to how we've handled things. And we begin to not so much lean into God as we lean into ourselves. We become overconfident and complacent. And it's in those moments that God has to step in and change our circumstances and put us back on track to begin to build our faith muscles, right? I think one of the ideas between BJ and Kara, kind of stretching him and stretching Braden and letting him go kind of out on his own at times and saying, hey, you're going to do this and do this is what to stretch him. We want to push, and God wants to push us. He wants us to grow. And to protect, it's always to protect us from trusting something other than God. If we're trusting in something other than God, then we're failing, right? But that test becomes this crisis of belief. Will I truly follow God? Or will I truly go the other way? And maybe today you're thinking about that. Maybe today you're going through that famine. Maybe today you're going through the struggles and the trials and the problems and the issues. Maybe somebody said something that's hurt you, or maybe things aren't going necessarily the way that you want them to. And whenever it comes to problems, whenever it comes to issues and everything else, right, we have this fight or flight kind of mentality. But what if we could learn to just stand still and wait on God? Because for a lot of us, we can't run away from our problems. We can't run away from our problems, but we're about to see how Abraham decides to run away from his problem. It says in verse 10 that a famine had entered the land. And Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. He decided that this famine is bad and this is a bad time, so I'm going to go somewhere where there's not a famine. I'm going to go somewhere where it's better, right? The grass is always greener on the other side, right? And when we have problems, we often run from the problems and we look over and we see how things look better over there, or maybe things aren't perfect here and maybe things aren't right here and we want to run, right? But that's not what commitment is about. Commitment isn't running when there's an issue. Commitment isn't running when things are dry or broken or not right. Commitment is standing and fighting and making sure that we're honoring God in the midst of it. And at times, it's just simply waiting on him. See, instead of remaining and trusting God, Abraham went down to Egypt. And when we see that and we hear that he went down, it reminds me of how at times, whenever we are struggling, we go down, right? Sin. The world. We're running to something other than God. Running away from God instead of towards God. And when circumstances become difficult and we're tempted to run, we must remain where God has placed us until he tells us to move. But often we run. See, the will of God will never lead us where the grace of God cannot care for us. The will of God will never lead us where the grace of God cannot care for us, but we don't often follow the will of God. Why? Because we're scared or we're afraid or we're weak or we're broken or we don't like it or we're just done. And we surrender, and that's not commitment. I love what Warren Wiersbe says this. He says, God alone is in control of your circumstances, and you are safer in a famine of his will than in a palace out of his will. You are safer in a famine of his will than in a palace out of his will. Do you believe that today? Abraham begins to run. He takes off and he grabs his wife and he grabs Lot and he grabs all of his goods and everything else, and they head down to Egypt. Now here's where the problem really begins, because a life on the run is a life undone, right? A life on the run. When you start running, things start unraveling in your life. When you start running, things start falling apart. Whenever you get out of God's will, that's whenever the true struggle hits. And we're about to see a big issue in his life. We're about to see a big, huge mistake in his life. And it all starts with this one phrase. And maybe if you're a husband or if you understand this. It says, as he went to Egypt, he said to his wife, he says, I know that you are a beautiful woman. Now, wives, if your husband ever comes to you and says that, don't the hairs on your back automatically stand up because you know something's wrong? Girl, you're pretty. Girl, you're amazing. Girl, I love you so much, so much. And you're just like, and? What's next? Well, this is a big one. This is a big one. He says, I know that you're a beautiful woman and how beautiful you are. So when we get to Egypt, I want you to do this. They're going to say, this is his wife. She's beautiful, and they'll kill me. But they'll let you live. How unfair is that? You're so beautiful. Whenever they see you, they're gonna see me, and they're gonna be like, this is his wife. Let's kill him and take his wife. I mean, he's not thinking about her in this moment, right? I mean, he started it off that way. Oh, you're so pretty, girl. So pretty, girl. But immediately he's like, when we get there, they're going to see how beautiful you are. And they're going to kill me, so I got a plan. It's a great plan. And because you're so beautiful, I want you to follow my plan. I want you to do this. When we get there, say you're my sister. What? When we get there, just say you're my sister. Just tell them that. Just say you're my sister so that I'll be treated well for your sake. Say you're my sister and my life will be spared because of you. And I mean, think how horrible this is. Okay, basically when we get there, just tell them you're my sister so any of them can marry you. Any of them can take you and I'll still live. I'll still be all right. Throw yourself down for me. You know, whenever we step out of God's will, when we step out of God's purpose, we make horrible decisions, right? Our life becomes undone, and we don't really think clearly why. Why? Because whenever our circumstances change, when things get dry, fear enters our mind, right? Fear enters our heart. It happens pretty quick. It happens pretty fast. And when we begin to trust ourselves, and when we begin to trust others, and we begin to trust our circumstances, we lose what our eyes should be set on. The truth of God and what he has for us. And fear floods in. And fear leads to compromise. And in this moment, whenever the famine hits, Abraham fears, and so what does he do? He runs, and then he heads down to Egypt, and he realizes, wait a minute, that's just going to add one more fear to the next. Because we can't run from our problems, right? And fear after fear, and a moment after moment. And you see, faith and fear can't dwell in the same heart. Faith and fear can't dwell in the same heart. One is going to take over the other. Either you're going to live a life of faith or you're going to live a life of fear. And in this moment, Abraham is not living a life of faith. He's living a life of fear. And I don't know why his wife buys into this, but she does. And they begin to head down, and it says, when Abraham came to Egypt, in verse 14, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. And he treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle and male donkeys and female donkeys and men servants and maid servants and camels. And I know some of you men are sitting here thinking, maybe I should sell my wife. Not a good idea. But the Lord inflicted, get this, the Lord inflicted a serious disease on the Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarah. And so Pharaoh summoned Abram and he said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? So that I took her in to be my wife. Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go, leave us. And when Pharaoh gave orders about Abram and his men, and he sent them away with his wife and everything that he had. See, when God called Abram, he told him, I'm going to make you a great nation. I want to do amazing things through you. I'm going to make you a blessing where whenever others are around you and they bless you, I'm going to bless them through you. I'm going to make you a huge and amazing blessing. But when we follow God, it's great because we are a blessing. But when we turn our backs on God and we refuse to follow him, we no longer become a blessing. We bring judgment into the mix. Why? Because when we compromise our faith, when we sin, there's always consequences, right? There's always consequences to our sin. See, the Bible tells us in Romans that the wages of sin is death. It's death. Every time it leads to death. It could be a physical death. It could be an emotional death. It could be a spiritual death. It can be a relational death. Whatever it is, it leads to death. And I can just imagine what kind of depths of death and despair and hopelessness this leads to. And maybe you're thinking today, man, that sounded good to me because he got all of the stuff and he got to leave with all of these great things. But even the blessings or even the good things that he got from the world and the things that he got later on, they're going to come back to haunt him. And things may be going okay when we turn ourselves from God for a while, but eventually it all comes back. Why? Because there are consequences to our sin. And we may live in the high life and we may be doing all right for a while, but eventually God is going to get us back on track. Why? Because he loves us. He loves us. And I was watching BJ and Braden, and as he was waiting for him to fall and everything else, and he was just going to let him fall, it reminded me that there are times whenever it comes to my own children that I'm going to have to let them fail. I'm going to have to let them make mistakes. I want to stop them, right? I want to fix everything, and I want to be there in the midst of everything, but I have to let them fail. Why? Because we learn sometimes more by failures than we do by success, right? And it's the same way with God. At times, God holds his word and he holds back and he waits to see how we're going to respond. Why? Because we learn more from our failures. And here in a moment, we're going to see what Abraham learned in this moment and how great it was and how there was the strength and power that came out of it. But I want you to learn this and get this. If you want to be a blessing to others, if you want to be truly, in God's will and everything, you've got to stay there. Because when you run out and when you take off, that's whenever you are stepping out of his will and you're letting go of that cover and that protection, and God is going to let you make those mistakes. Now there's grace. There's always grace, right? And it's so great because here in a moment we're going to see the grace of God and the beauty of God and everything else. But I just want to hit this side note just real quick. Grace is not a free get out of jail card, right? Grace is not this thing where I can go and do whatever I want to. I think Paul says it great in Romans where he says all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial, right? We're covered in grace. But it doesn't mean it's going to go well for us if we do it. Why? Because there's consequence. When we sin, there's consequence. And it comes back. And so, can you imagine? I mean, I love that it says that God intervened here. God intervened here. Why? How did he intervene? Well, he sent a disease, and it kind of woke up Pharaoh, and Pharaoh realized that there was a problem, and then they realized that it was Sarah and everything else, and they went on. But can you imagine this? God had promised Abraham. He said, you're going to be the father of a great nation. I'm going to do great things through you and your wife. And then what does Abraham do? He immediately, gives his wife away. Can you imagine if she would have married Pharaoh? All of the blessing in a moment would have been gone. But praise God that he intervened, and that's grace. That's grace. Now, Abraham wasn't a smart dude, and it kind of gives me hope because later on he's going to do the same thing. He's going to try to do the same trick. He's going to go, hey, remember that time in Egypt where you pretended to be my wife? Why don't you do it again? And that's us, right? We struggle in and out. We go in and out. We battle. We fight. We stew. But there's grace that covers us, and we can go back to God. And I love what Abraham does next. In verse 1 of chapter 13, it says, so Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev, and with his wife and everything that he had, and Lot went with him. And Abram had become very wealthy with the livestock and silver and in gold. And from Negev, he went from place to place until he came where? To Bethel. To the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built the altar. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. He called on the name of the Lord. He got himself right. Why? I think Adrian Rogers says it best. He says, at the heart of every problem is a problem of the heart. At the heart of every problem is a problem of the heart. Whenever I stray from God, whenever you stray from God, whenever we run and we do our own thing, it's a heart problem. It's a heart issue, right? It's inside of us. We don't truly trust God. We don't truly rely on God. And Abram realized that he had turned his back on God, and at no point did he ever pray. I mean, whenever the famine hit, it didn't say that famine hit, and immediately Abraham dropped to his knees and prayed. No, it says that the famine hit and Abraham ran? When struggle comes, when strife comes, when trouble comes, what do? Are you hitting your knees? Or are we running? Are we trusting in him and relying on him? Or are we trusting in ourselves? Because that only brings trouble. That only brings strife. And Abraham had learned from his mistake, and he went back and he set up his tent and his altar. And he returned to a life of worship. See, he met God at the altar realizing that everything was under God's control and not his control, and how far we have to go sometimes. Sometimes we have to go so far to learn that. But what if we could really, truly learn just to wait on the Lord? Just to be patient with the Lord. Abraham had learned what it really meant to trust in the Lord and to be committed to him, and to not live for himself, but to live for others and to live outside of himself. But a problem is about to arise. Another issue is about to arise. And Abraham's about to have to deal with this next problem. I want you to see how he does it, because the first time he failed, right? The first time he messed up, but he is going to make the right choice here. And I want you to see what it looks like. It says in verse 5, now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, and a quarrel broke out among them, arose between Abram's herdsmen and those of Lot. And the Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land among them. So it's like overcrowded, right? It's like a famine in itself. It's overcrowding and too many issues and struggles. And so Abraham has a choice here. And he turns to Lot and he looks at Lot and he says, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and my herdsmen. For we are brothers. It's not the land, the whole land before you. Let's part company. And if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. And he looks at Lot and he doesn't think of himself. I mean, Abraham has every right? He's the leader. He's the guy. Lot's his nephew. Lot should fall in line. He has this moment where he gets up and he says, okay, Lot, you go do this, and you go do this, and you go do this, and you go do this. But what he does is he does something amazing. He's kind of learned from God, and God gives us choices, and he gives us a way to do stuff. And he says, I want to let you make this choice in this moment. I'm going to put it on your shoulders. I'm going to trust you in this. Which way do you want to go? Which way do you want to go? But see, there's something you need to know about Lot. He was struggling. His faith wasn't strong. It wasn't where it needed to be, and we're going to see that a lot in life. A lot in Lot's life. We're going to see how he battled and how he hurt and how he struggled and how he didn't often turn to God. But Abraham wanted to grow that faith in him, and he wanted to grow that faith in him. And if we're to grow our faith in others, we have to at times trust them. We have to at times let them fall. And it's hard. It hurts. But we have to do it. And he looks at Lot and he says this. He says, pick what you want. And Lot looks over the whole land, and he saw the whole plain, and the Jordan was well watered like the gardens of the Lord, like the land of Egypt toward Zoar. I want you to hear that again. He says that he looked out and he saw the whole plain of the Jordan, and he was well watered like the garden of the Lord, like the what? The land of Egypt. Lot's heart was still stuck in the world. Abraham had come back and set up his tent and began to worship God. I think Lot came back and he set up his tent, and he was still longing for Egypt. He was still longing to return to that old life. Where are we at? Are you trusting God, or are you longing for something more? See, there's no benefit to disobedience. There's no benefit to turning our back on God. And it may look like the better option. It may look like a great thing. It may look amazing, but there's going to become a time that compromise always has a price. And next week we're going to look at Lot, and we're going to see the price that he paid. But I want you to look at this. Abraham trusted God, and he didn't look out at the land. He looked up to God. Lot made his choice, and he sets out. When he begins to go into the land, and he leaves. And Lot lived among the cities in the plain, and he set up his tents near Sodom. And now the men of Sodom were wicked, and they were sinning greatly against the Lord, and he had turned his back on God. And in verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, he said, after Lot had parted from him, he said this, he said, lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south and east and west, and all the land that you see I will give you, and your offspring forever. And I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and the breadth of the land that I am giving you. And so Abram moved his tents, and he went to live near the great trees of Mamre and Hebron, where he built an altar to God. See, Lot's heart was still in Egypt, and so he went back to the world, right? But Abraham his heart was with God, so he waited and he stayed. And then God opened his eyes and he spoke to him. There's nothing more beautiful than when God speaks to our heart, when he opens our eyes. We have to have an attitude of, I will give God a chance to show up. I will give God a chance, an opportunity to move. When Abram made the mistake at the beginning, he made the mistake by saying, I will take the initiative and do what I want to save myself. But it's not about that. It's about waiting on God. Will we wait on God? See, the discipline that Abram experienced in going down to Egypt had taught him to trust God. And now God could trust him. Now God could use him. And it's your faith in God that determines how much God uses you and blesses you, right, as we follow him and we stay in his will. But there are going to be times when we struggle. There are going to be times whenever things go wrong. There are going to be times whenever we don't see God. There's going to be times whenever he's silent and he doesn't pour out. And there are going to be times when we have to just stand there and wait. To be still. To believe God. And to lean in with all your heart. Will you do that today? Even when God is silent, will you be still? Or will you run? Will you believe God or will you believe yourself? Will you lean into him with all your heart? Why does that matter? Why does it matter that we're still and we wait on God? Why does it matter that we lean into him with all that we have? Why does it matter that we're his and truly trusting in him and we believe the promises of God? I think it's because of this. When we believe, when we truly trust God, no test is impossible. No failure is permanent. And no problem is too big. When we truly trust God, just look at the life of Abraham for a moment. No test is impossible, right? No failure is too big. He was still able to go back to God. There's grace. And no problem is too big. How are you trusting God? How am I trusting God? Will we let it be? Let it be his? Will we be still? Will we believe God? Will we wait on him? So many of us run. So many of us try to do it ourselves, but we can't. It only leads to brokenness. A life on the run is a life undone. Be still. Believe God. And lean into him with all your heart. Let's pray. Father God, I don't know the hearts of everyone in this room, but you do. God, we are fully known and we are fully loved by you, God. You know every aspect. You know that there are those in this room that are on the run. They've been running from you, God. They've been trying to do it on their own, God, and it's time that we stop, God. It's time that we truly put our faith in you, God. There's going to be famines. There's going to be deserts. There's going to be hard times. But really, that's the time that we should lean in closer to you and we really see your love and your grace and your power and your might, God. If Abram would have simply waited, if he would have stayed, so much heartache would have been avoided, God. And it's the same for us. Teach us to wait on you. Teach us to see your love and grace, God. Teach us to lean into you, God. And if there's someone in this room, God, that doesn't know you, and they've been on their own, God, trying to make it on their own, God, I pray that they would see that God loved them so much, that you love them so much, that you sent your son to die on the cross for them. And God, if we simply believe in you, we trust in you, we lay our lives at your feet, you save us. If you're in this room and you have questions about God and you have questions about what it means to follow him and be his, find me after the service. Find someone and ask the questions. God, I thank you for the times. I thank you for the times that you're quiet. I thank you for the times that you withhold your voice. because it's you stretching our faith. And God, may we respond correctly in those times of silence. When things get quiet, may we respond by simply being still, by believing you, and by leaning in with all of our heart. In your name we pray. Amen.